Hello.
How's last day of inbound feeling? Awesome. Well, we are so glad to be here. I'm Karen. I run product at HubSpot. And I have with me Olivier from OpenAI. Olivier, tell us a little bit about your role and what you do.
Hi, everyone. First, thanks so much for having me. Love HubSpot. I was telling Karen the other day, I was a HubSpot customer, I think, back in 2012.
Yeah.
And so
Don't hear that, 2012.
I've seen the product evolve quite a bit. I'm Olivier. I lead product for the business products and platform at OpenAI. So all the products that businesses, startups, enterprises, developers, SMBs use.
We use very many of the products that Olivier builds. Both of us kind of have a platforms API background, and we love a lot of them. So Olivier, this whole conference this week has been around AI, speed of AI disruption is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. What do you see, what's the true story that you see at OpenAI about AI adoption? Like, what is working for businesses?
Quite a bit. It started clearly with knowledge work, like ChatGPT type use case. How can I get an assistant to better write, to better consume my content? And now we're seeing essentially AI being adopted across many more industry specific workflows. So coding is a big one, of course. I don't have the latest stats, but on the platform we have millions of developers using the models and ChatGPT in order to code better. At OpenAI, I don't have the latest stat, but a significant fraction of our code is now written at that point by AI assistants. And that's the case for other businesses as well. Coding is a big one. Customer support is huge as well. We've been working with companies like T-Mobile and many others to automate both text and voice customer support. And we're starting to see extremely strong quality feedback and adoption. That's good. I'm seeing adoption across healthcare as well, both on the more admin side, generating documentation, and also on the drug discovery side.
Interesting.
We are seeing adoption across financial services. So frankly, at that point, it's in many industries, and starting with more surface level workflows and going deeper and deeper into the workflows that are actually the beating heart of the business.
Yeah, I love that, beating heart of the business. You mentioned financial and healthcare.
Yeah.
Are there specific security or privacy or things that you see that are unique to those fields, or?
Completely. LLMs, models, have one superpower, which is both amazing and a little scary. Amazing superpower is that a model can process and digest huge amount of information.
Yeah.
Structured, unstructured information at blazing speed. And so cuts across silos, cuts across different data sources, extremely useful. But also you have to tame that power. You have to make sure that the LLM is not going to just retrieve the one notes of my CFO, and show it to me. So there is huge consideration on essentially access permission, what content, what permissions you require essentially for the model to be able to safely access it. And so I would say that's probably one of the biggest focus of OpenAI over the next few months is okay, we have that amazing capability, that amazing intelligence. How do we tame it? So essentially CFO, CISO essentially can use it confidently without fear of leak of unauthorized access.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I know even with the connector we built with you all, the ChatGPT, that level of permissions was so important, and then how that data ended up being used was super important for us to keep customer trust.
Yeah.
When I first met Olivier, one of the things that he said is, well, there's ChatGPT, GPT-5 now, which, you have a router and a switcher. But before then, you had a ton of models. You had O1 Mini, you had O1 Pro, O3. One thing Olivier would say when I first met him was just how to describe Mini and Pro, this genius intern in a room. But tell us a little about that. How do you think about giving guidance earlier in the models? What's the difference between a Mini and a Pro?
I have a very simple analogy. I basically look at the types of people I've been working with in my career, and then try to map them to
models.
Exactly. And I think the analogy I use, which I still use today, is we essentially have two types of models in the background, large and small models. And the usual assumption is that small models are slightly dumber in terms of intelligence, which is actually not the case. Oftentimes, small models are equally smart, but they have way less knowledge. Think of of your brain, and how much of your brain is actually used to store information, store data, and there's probably a sort of a core of the brain which is used for intelligence.
Yeah.
We've been trying essentially for the past month and year to essentially identify that core. And so the way I think about the small model is more a genius 18-year-old intern in a black room, no window, no doors, no view on the outside world, but still extremely smart, And for some use cases, that makes sense. You're purely optimizing for, intelligence. And for some use cases, you do require world knowledge. And so, larger models are useful for that.
Yeah, I love that analogy, but be nice to the 18-year-old in the room. That's a genius. We talked a lot about data at this conference and how important structured, unstructured, and external world data is. Because you can't have full intelligence if you don't really know what's happening. If you don't have the street smarts almost, how do you build that into models? It's easier with GPT-5 because you don't really have to pick models anymore. But if you were giving people advice on how to think about when to use what model, when, how to use prompting to figure out how to switch, what advice would you give people as they're using GPT?
My very practical advice is do not optimize for cost and latency initially. Optimize for intelligence. Try to find something that works, essentially. Let's say, for instance, you want to, you want to automate some financial reports generation. Get the smartest model, the biggest model, try to make it work. Once you work, you have a baseline, and then you can start to optimize and, having smaller model, tuning some prompt, removing some context, but essentially, do not prematurely optimize for cost and latency. There is a time for that. That would be one. Number two is, frankly, AI engineering requires a lot of iteration. It usually doesn't work, it's pretty easy to do a cool demo, a very shiny demo that people love. But getting to 99.9% of accuracy is much harder. And that just requires a lot of iteration. There is no cookbook on here are the 5 steps to do it. It requires people who are essentially really knowledgeable at every step of the workflow to optimize each inch of it.
Cool. So using AI, picking models, if you're building products with AI, what about if you're using AI a little bit like your teammate or helping, right? So we're agents. What's your point of view on how do you move from a proof of concept to using AI day-to-day in your workflows or using potentially an agent day-to-day in your workflows?
Yeah, I think it will start with your personal usage. I'm seeing, it's funny, Sam said something maybe a year ago that really struck with me. I didn't get it at the time. He was telling me hey, look at how Gen Z uses ChatGPT.
Yeah.
They use it more and more as an OS. And I was not quite getting it, and I think I'm getting it now, which is people are more and more using the model essentially to store every piece of knowledge, thoughts, impressions they have during the day. Just if you had an extremely trusted chief of staff, you want to use them as a second brain in a way to jam on ideas. And I'm seeing more and more it's actually using ChatGPT for that. And I think that gives you an idea of what does an agent actually mean? What does it mean to give memory to a model, to an agent? What does it mean to have a model learn from your interactions over time? And so once usually that gives you a pretty good sense of what the models are capable of and where agents are going. And then you want to apply that to your business, right? You want to start to automate customer support. You want to start to automate some coding tasks. Here I would say start small. Identify a small tiger team in your company. The way I've seen it work usually is that those are not top level mandates usually do not work. You empower a few people, cross-functional people to essentially iterate, hack on something, and then you grow the scope over time. And it may not look super impressive at first. Maybe at first they will just do I don't know, better data labeling of tickets.
Yeah.
But over time, once that works, you increase the scope, and then you can tackle on the actual customer facing automation work.
Can you give us a peek inside OpenAI? How might you guys solve an impossible task or do something?
Oh man,
Different.
OpenAI is wild. OpenAI was a research lab initially. It's still a research lab, but we have now a product org on top. And I think we kept from the research lab the sort of the bottoms up innovation, extreme independence. You don't tell a researcher give me a 1-year roadmap and execute it. You give researchers space for them to try out some stuff, Some will work, some will not. And so we're trying to apply essentially that cultural mindset, across like, product, go-to-market, and of course research. Something very concrete, which we've been doing for the past like, few months, the models in GPT-5 are getting extremely good at coding applications. And so typically, as a product person, like the usual like thing is that you write like a product brief, right? You write like 5 pages on like, hey, here's my product, here's what it does, blah, blah, blah. Here are like some mocks, which I wrote like pretty quickly. My bet is that you would spend probably less time just prototyping, frankly, with like GPT-5 Codex Cursor. And it gives you like a much better feel of what the thing actually does. So way more prototyping going on with AI, way more access to insights, information across the company. Like, I run like the product team, like, I don't have like that much time anymore, like, to spend a ton of time in customer meetings. But, every meeting is like recorded and I can essentially fetch them from ChatGPT and, understand like the insights. Like that's been really useful as well. And then finally, like, letting people experiment. I mean, frankly, that would be the thing. Like, the reality is that, I think there are some use cases which are very well known with AI, like coding automation, like, support automation. There are many, many more use cases to discover. With every model, we see what we call like emergent properties of the model, like properties that we did not really anticipate or prepare for, and that enable new use cases. And, no one is better positioned than, subject matter expert in a company to discover those use cases.
Yeah, it's cool. We see the same thing for product development at even HubSpot. We use a lot more prototyping, a lot of these tools that do that. There are a lot of founders and entrepreneurial small business owners and others in the room. If you were kind of giving them advice, like, what are like 1 or 2 metrics you might give them as like, what do you look at for, is AI delivering its value?
Yeah.
And maybe it's not as clean cut as that. You kind of mentioned space for experimentation.
I think metrics are quite use case specific, but the one sort of a criteria I like a lot is telling your team, okay, you have like, your automation going in AI. Let's assume tomorrow we shut down everything. How much of that is like, a complete like blow essentially to the way you work versus, nice to have, we'll figure it out. And usually that's a good test of, if you're really delivering, that core value. So that's a sort of a litmus test I've been using quite a bit. The second litmus test, frankly, is, looking at like your sort of a top customer design partners, like how much do they actually use it? Like, you look at like your usually most bleeding edge customers, like whatever those customers are doing, all the others will do it in 6 months or in a year. And, are they using it every day, once a day, nice to have, core features, like, obsessing like, data and observability over that group of customers.
Yeah, I love that. Like, definitely your best customers using some of those patterns, you're going to see them, 6 months from
exactly.
now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. We talked a little bit about the financial healthcare and how data and training is so important. Like, how would you advise people to think about like guardrails in using it?
Yeah.
Like, what are kind of guardrails people should think about in safety and security training?
So guardrails are really, really interesting. I don't know if you remember there was like a fun like anecdote like a year or 2 ago where some guy was like buying like Chevys for like $1, like, the chatbot or something, So essentially you want guardrails to prevent that kind of behavior. Like you don't want the model to just say yes to everything. Because the model like default is to say yes to everything, right? I mean, they have knowledge, like, they can reason about everything. And so, there are some topics which are off limit. Like if I'm doing a financial assistant, I don't want an assistant to be used like for the math homework of like my users. Or, there are some, I don't want the assistant to refund like more than $10, for instance. And so that's called like, guardrails. It's been very top of mind for the past year, especially as we go into like more and more like high stakes like industries. I'm going to give you 2 examples. I've been working for GPT-5 with Amgen. Amgen is a pharmaceutical company, which is basically building anti-cancer like drugs. And basically their scientists, use like, the models in order to test, new drugs and analyze data. Example number 1. Example number 2 is I've been working quite a bit with the financial industry as well. Been working with BBVA, which is probably the largest bank in Spain right now, and a pretty big like, bank in Europe, to essentially power like their financial analyst, essentially. And so here, essentially, like in general, like the response of the model like is really important, accuracy-wise. But for those industries, the response is extremely important in terms of accuracy, like it's really high stakes. And it turns out that, the models are getting pretty good at what we call instruction following, which is you give them like a set of like 500 instructions.
Yeah.
Like, hey, here at HubSpot, like this is the brand guidelines, this is what we do, this is what you should never say. If you have that question, escalate to that human, essentially. Like, there are lots of instructions. And GPT-5 is getting pretty good, essentially, at like following each of them accurately. And so that's one of the top metric evaluation that we measure at the moment for model. And so it's been like, very top of mind. And so usually, like, Guardrails, gather your subject matter expert. Usually they have like their SOP, like, standard operating procedure in their head. Like,
what is SOP?
SOP are the standard operating procedures. Like, if you're, let's say, you're doing customer support, like, for like a complex product, my gut, 80% of like the rules are in people's heads. They're not even documented somewhere. And so if you just document like what's, on Jira or like Google Docs, like you will not get essentially the full picture. And so a lot of the process is, to like push people to write down essentially like what they know and how like the bot essentially should behave. And so, gather the subject matter expert, put them in the prompt, define like a good like metric, like eval essentially of, to measure, to make sure that the model like complies with those instructions. And then you run that against, a few examples in production.
Cool. How do you think, one of the topics, you're just like, how do you think, like kind of in the marketing, sales, or service, you mentioned customer success or customer service a lot. How do you think buying behavior is going to change, like in ChatGPT or in LLMs?
I think sales and marketing are probably the functions on which we see the highest adoption at the moment of LLMs. Some of them are like cutting edge, like bleeding edge I've seen. Number one, frankly, is just like, it gives you, again, tapping on the superpower of models, which is to digest millions of like documents, pieces of content at the same time. Like, as a marketer or like a salesperson, like that's golden, essentially. Like you're preparing a meeting, you're preparing a campaign, you're, targeting like a fairly complex audience with like different needs, which is very nuanced. Like having essentially like access to that, source of data, source of content is like, pretty key. So that I'm seeing quite a bit. The second thing which I'm seeing quite a bit is using like LLMs, agent, as essentially like brainstorm, like jam partners. You're a marketer, you're doing a campaign, like, you have a ton of context of what you want to do. Like, sometimes you can feel a little lonely because, you have so much context and, there is no one really like to jam with. And, the LLMs are pretty good essentially at like, being at the right level and like, having like leveling up level set essentially with you. So I'm seeing that as well. The last point which we're seeing more and more is like ultra personalized marketing. Like with LLMs, like, you basically have the premise to essentially offer that kind of personalization of like content, messaging, information at massive scale. And so if I would, bet, I think that's probably the next frontier.
Yeah, makes sense. Our two companies have built this ChatGPT or HubSpot connector for ChatGPT. What do you think looks like a good AI partnership? Like what does that look like?
It's a good question. And that one is good because it worked very well. I think like the defining characteristics of that sort of partnerships is, one, the models are as good as the data you provide to them, right? Yeah. Like with my analogy of like, that intern, like with that little knowledge, in a way that could extend to like all models. Like they know a lot about like the internet, Wikipedia, like, scientific papers. But of course, like any data which is behind a firewall, which is, behind a tool like HubSpot, the model's not aware. And so feeding like the right like amount and type of context in the model is absolutely key. And so that would be number one, like, the good partnerships are identifying like where like more data to intelligence could essentially provide like a ton of value and what is like the right shape and, amount of data that you should provide to the model. That would be one. Number two, I think is the best partnerships I've seen essentially like, figure out the right like form factors in terms of UX. Like models are weird in a way, like they're not like any type of software frankly we've seen before. And so, They are already working well for like, some pretty common use cases, but, for more like prosumer, pro, like, work, like enterprise use cases, like we're still figuring out, how do people, like, give you an example, like, are people okay to see like a different chart and like diagram every time, like, they log in on ChatGPT or something else? Or do they want like, more like stability? Do they want to see the exact same dashboard every time, Like where essentially can we afford like dynamic content versus, where do we need to provide like, stability? And so in my experience, like, I'm no like sales and marketing expert. And so, working with the companies who've been like sweating the details of those tools with customers for years and years is usually how we find essentially the right form factor. And the last like, thing that I would mention on like partnerships is, maybe that's like a truism, but like AI is so new to everyone, right? Like it's crazy. It's only been like 2 or 3 years essentially that ChatGPT happens.
It is.
Like, I think we've just like we're scratching the surface on the use cases of these models. And so we're looking for partners essentially who are on that journey with us. Like, I believe that, we've like touched like 1% frankly of the application that we could do. And so, I would love to get that 1% right, but I'm also looking for partners who are going to, explore essentially that, whole white space with us and, try some use cases, some will work, some won't, but, that's a journey for sure.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons the partnership or like the connector has been so fun. When we built the connector, it really is that context, that HubSpot context that we have, that we want like to power with ChatGPT. And then our team built an OAuth layer on top just to make sure that the data is, you're allowed to see, your user permissions are respected, and that your data is never used to train that model just to get the tool better. So it's a really great way of combining the power of context.
Pretty amazing. Like we see now people, like business owner, who are basically writing in ChatGPT, like, hey, give me reports on like, my sales, like, performance for the past like, month. And getting the data like directly like pulled in, it's a pretty magical experience.
Yeah, it's definitely magical. Like I've gotten text messages, day of. I've had 5 months. I've had this question out from like my RevOps team, and in 5 seconds, I was able to run a deep research on
completely.
HubSpot context.
I've seen like before that, there were questions that were so basic that I had that I felt ashamed essentially to ask to my RevOps team. I was like, it's not worth their time. I'm sure there's a dashboard somewhere, and I never went to look for the dashboard. And so now having essentially that single like entry point where I know that the thing is going to fetch information across the place, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. How do you think about ChatGPT or even any of the models, I guess? How do you think of it as a platform? Like what's going to happen as a platform or an ecosystem?
It's a good question. It's a good question. It's something that we're still figuring it out, frankly. It's clear that people use ChatGPT for like many, many use cases, including use cases that require information or action from like other services. The typical example would be like, people spend a ton of time planning their trips on ChatGPT.
I do, that's my first case.
I'm the same at that point, frankly. Like, hey, I'm going with like 1 week with kids, blah, 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 and having like super personalized plan. And so the next question is, like, could I just like book some stuff, like some activities or something, on ChatGPT? And so we've been like trying to find essentially the right, like, design, I would say, and incentives, to make that work like properly, as a platform. That would be number one. The second thing that we've been trying a lot as well is in a work setup. So typically what we're doing, with you on HubSpot, which is, hey, people at work have lots of tools that they love to use on a daily basis. Like, they use a CRM, they use like, some data dashboard. And so, we need a way essentially to connect ChatGPT to those tools, like essentially combine like the ease of use and like the intelligence of ChatGPT with like the actual power tools that people use. And so, connectors are part of it. We've seen quite a bit of adoption of like GPTs, which are basically our no-code little apps that people can build on top of ChatGPT. So, the work like, collaboration and tools have been pretty interesting as well. So yeah, we're still working on it. We'll iterate, but yeah, I think you can expect like more and more over time that, we'll be able essentially to take more actions on ChatGPT.
Do you think people will like end up monetizing on top of a platform like ChatGPT? Whatever you can share.
Maybe. I think we're still focused at the moment on the value prop, frankly. Like making the thing like obviously useful, for the users of ChatGPT. And then, we'll figure out like monetization later. But yeah, at the moment, like, coming back to that journey, we are 1% there. We're seeing use cases of ChatGPT, and LLMs like all the time. And so trying to find, what are like the right product abstractions, what is the right design essentially, to enable use cases. And then we'll figure out like, the more commercial aspect later.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates a lot with us, which is like value first.
Exactly.
For the customer use cases, and
exactly.
then everything will come up.
Exactly.
Yeah. If you were going to predict, like with a magic wand, like what does 2027 look like?
Oh man, 2027. Even like, early 2026, like, you would have asked me like, January 1st, 2026, I'd be like,
I'll give you 2026.
No, 2027. If I were to take a mega step back, I think there have been essentially two major breakthroughs, like in AI, over the past couple of years. Breakthrough number one was, pre-training of like GPT, like, GPT-1, GPT-2, GPT-3. Like essentially you train the model, like larger and larger model, and the thing is like more and more intelligent. Breakthrough number two was O1, the first model, like the first reasoning model, a model that can think before it answers. For O1, like the way I like to think about it is I think we're basically at the GPT-2 or 3 level of maturity of that technology. Like reasoning models, and GPT-5 is a reasoning model, we are like not even 1% there, frankly. Like, we have like a long way to go to scale essentially that breakthrough. And so expect that we have like easily like, like month, maybe a year plus of like, pure execution to essentially, scale and like have larger and larger models, which are more and more intelligent. So I expect that we haven't, so prediction number one, I expect that we haven't touched the ceiling at all in terms of intelligence and capabilities. And I expect that intelligence and capabilities will essentially transfer to, accuracy, reliability, like all the practical challenges that people have with AI. So more intelligence. Cost. I would be shocked if cost was not going down further. It's hard to see from the outside, but the technical infrastructure on which models run is so new. Like the science, like the art of like networking together, like, 100,000 GPUs and to get like the most like, computing power out of it, like is relatively new. And so there are like, there is room for like optimization, efficiencies like all over the place. If you layer on that, the actual like, servers, like, the chips are getting like more and more powerful, like, it is going to essentially improve like, cost and performance as well. The last, my last hope, I would say, like, for 2027 is, I think by 2027, like, we'll actually have like the premise of like a personal assistant that follows you everywhere. At the moment, like, an assistant like ChatGPT is like really cool, but, it's like on ChatGPT.com, you have to feed it context, I think at some point, like ChatGPT will just be like, in like every surface, of your life. Like, I want ChatGPT to be in my car, I want ChatGPT to be, I don't know, like, on my laptop, my, personal phone. I want ChatGPT to have as much context as, I do, like, for it to know, about like, my calendar, like my family, and,
Right.
I want it to be essentially like a sort of a chief of staff, which has worked with me for like 20 years, essentially, in terms of depth. And that requires, of course, like a lot of like, integration, connection, like data connections. That requires as well, like, to make like the core, like, quality of the model, like even better. But my expectation is, 2 years, like, we should get there.
Amazing. What are you working on now, or what can you tell us about what's cooking?
Oh man, what are we working on? A lot. We are working, if I were to sum up, we are working pretty much on all the above, like making the model smarter. GPT-5, freaking amazing. Like, I think GPT-5 is the first model where I'm like, okay, I'm definitely dumber than that model. Like, at that point, like, there is no question about it. But again, not the ceiling. Like, we'll keep making that models much better. Cost, I think we can easily have multiples of, improvement, like cost and latency improvement over the coming month and year. And then, enabling that, personal assistant, that reliable personal assistant at work and, in personal life. Like, that's pretty much one of the core, like, initiatives of OpenAI.
Amazing. I guess, like, any advice you'd leave for the audience?
Any advice? Things are going to get crazy, even more crazy, which is, pretty mad given, like, how fast it's been moving. My single biggest advice, frankly, is, try it out. Like, I've been studying with so many people like who were like quite skeptical of ChatGPT when it first started.
Yeah.
Because, it had like issues like hallucinations and, slowness, etc. But, the pace at which the technology is changing, like you should try like every 3 months, essentially, like, the thing again. And I bet you, like, some stuff that you thought would be like completely sort of impossible like to achieve, like, you'll be surprised essentially how many of those are being knocked down one by one. So yeah, try ChatGPT, try to build stuff like new application, empower like the best like doers, like builders in your organization. And those are not only like engineers, like product people, they can be like subject matter expert like in the team, like who knows everything and loves to optimize. So, empower those people, like those are the people who are going to essentially emerge new use cases.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, empower your builders, try things, bring context. But thanks so much for giving us a glimpse into the future.
Thanks so much.